The player looked at the screen, smiling ever so slightly. It was completely blank, save for the two white, pixelized words in the center.
Connection severed.
At first, it was a relief to the player. In the past few hours, they had gone through a lot of strange occurrences, the whole game seeming to be trying to convince them to keep playing or to do the opposite. And they had chosen the latter option. But seeing those two words sparked a form of confusion in their minds. They had just gone through the process that should have deleted their save file. And they had went through them entirely, even accepting that it'd be permanent. But then why didn't it just say file deleted or something like that? The player stared at the screen some more, wondering what they had just done. If they had severed the connection, then that meant that their soul, which they used to control Chris, the player character of the game, was no longer tied to Chris. The connection severed, as the game stated. And if that was the case, then the player would be fine with the choice. They had seen Chris' actions, how they felt about the soul, and with it, the player. So giving Chris the freedom, and untying the link between Chris and the soul, was the least they could do. But, what would happen after that? Chris no longer had a soul. They couldn't save or load. They couldn't make use of the determination within it. Their strings had been cut, but at what costs? No, they'd be fine. Chris was going to be able to handle it. Throughout everything, they were clearly able to handle their own decisions. So why was the player so concerned about them? Maybe it was the uncertainty of not knowing what would happen next. Or maybe it was the curiosity of what they set in motion. Perhaps they could try and do something. Even if their choices didn't matter, they could at least influence the right ones. But without the connection, how would they do so? The player minimized the window with the two simple words, before opening the inner files of the game. If they could somehow forge a different link in some form, maybe they could watch from a distance. But they wanted to avoid the link with Chris after all. They were free now. That was to be left alone regardless. But shockingly, there was very little to work with. There were no files of the game itself. Just basic programs for it to run. This was abnormal. Most games would have core files, sprites, music, something used in the game itself. But there was nothing here, save for the files that were made to run the window that was currently open. As the player rummaged through the files though, there were a few things that caught their eye. Files made to link the window with something else. The code was a bit more patchwork than they expected, but it clearly worked well enough. Upon pulling it up in an editor, it was somewhat clearer how it worked. Firstly, the player would create a false avatar. Then they'd make choices, that would be soon thrown away. This would drill the mentality of choices don't matter into their head. And finally, the program would take the soul which became linked via those choices and insert it into Chris. However, after the player had completed those steps, the program had been discarded as it became obsolete. And shockingly, the avatar that was created was still there, too. Discarded but not deleted. So the player got to work. They adjusted the code ever so slightly, making it so that the avatar they created would be the target for the soul insertion, instead of Chris. As they restarted the game window, they held their breath. This was going to be risky for sure, but it was their only shot. And it had to be taken. And upon seeing the save file screen once again, a sigh of relief was given. This was a good start. Maybe they could actually do this. Well, until they realized that loading the save file was pointless. With save 1 being tied to Chris, it registered as corrupted, meaning that they didn't have access to it. So they'd have to load a backup file. And while it was from a while earlier, it would do the job. So the player highlighted save file 2, and opened it up. Perhaps taking a back seat for this wasn't a bad thing. After all, their choices didn't matter anyways. Right.